Welcome to Conversations in a Vintage Shop, a podcast from behind my counter between customers. Join me while I sit behind my retail counter and just have a conversation with you, or with myself. While I look out the window, observe what I see, things that are happening in the store today, throughout the week, and just fun little stories that I have from my time as a business owner. This is something that you find interesting, then keep listening, and I appreciate you. Hey everyone, thank you for joining me back on another episode of Conversations in a Vintage Shop podcast, where I bring conversations I have in my shop right here to you. And today I'm trying something a little different. I'm not playing my shop music while I'm recording this. That may change, but I've put it on pause just to give a little bit more clarity when I'm speaking. But if you do end up hearing that music come back on, again, old habits die hard. I'll try to edit it out as best I can. But in today's episode, I'm really excited to talk about a topic that I'm extremely passionate about and I love discussing, and that is seeing fashion as art. Now, when I talk to friends and customers who make garments, design garments, the number one thing I always hear is how they don't see what they do as being taken as seriously as other mediums like photography, painting, sculpture, even though it's all under the same umbrella of arts and humanities. And with fashion, it's so much deeper and complex. And I'm going to just talk about how I see the two sides of it and why I see fashion as not only art, but a significant piece of our history and our way of understanding societies that came before us. So if that is something that you are interested in, stay tuned. Now, as you're listening to this episode, the sad thing is I'm actually re-recording this. I had already recorded this episode previously. But as one can imagine, when you are recording a podcast during shop hours, there are a lot of distractions, and I was very distracted when I was recording that. So I don't think my points were getting across as well as I wanted them to. I had a lot of awkward pauses and breaks because I was just paying attention to what was going on outside, people coming in. What a shock, right? So I am re-recording this. And one thing I wanted to bring into this re-recording that I had in the last one was just a little bit of a shop update. And if you follow along with my shop social media, if you're not, it's Instagram at Carmine and Hayworth, Facebook, Carmine and Hayworth. You may have noticed that I've been selling off more pieces from my vintage collection, whether that be clothing, makeup, jewelry. And the reason why, and this isn't something I'm going to talk about on my socials yet, only here, is there's another Julian's auction. Now, as I'm filming this, it's still August. When you listen to this, I will be in the thick of it. It's a 3-day Hollywood auction. It's Hollywood Legends, and it's another collaboration between Turner Classic Movies and Julian's Auctions in Beverly Hills. Now, if you listen to my prior episode on what I won from the last Julian's auctions, you heard a little bit about my process and the planning that goes behind it. Now, this one, I've been on another level in terms of planning. I have multiple items that I am gunning for, and I'm trying to build up as much capital as I can. And I'm not going to talk about what exactly I'm going for yet, but it's a lot of pieces. And there's one piece in particular that I'm not completely confident I'm going to have a chance to obtain. But it's from someone who you never see pieces from this individual come up for auction. It's very, very rare. And this one particularly has provenance that is going to make it pretty valuable, which is why I'm not confident I'm going to get it, because this one could go for a lot of money if you have the right bidders at the auction who appreciate this individual. So if you're listening to this the first week of September, send me all the positive vibes you can, that I can be quick on the draw and can obtain some of these really cool pieces that I will have display in my shop. Now, I talked previously about having framed my Debbie Reynolds MGM bra, and I have this really great idea for a display I'm going to do coming up in the shop where you can come in, see the pieces I have from Broadway, Elizabeth Taylor, Debbie Reynolds, you can read more about them, ask questions, see them up close and personal. And that's, again, been my goal, obtaining these items, is bringing these pieces to little old Fargo, North Dakota, and kind of giving it that hit of culture that we so desperately need here. So stay tuned. If I do win anything, you better believe it's going to be another episode. But if you don't hear anything after this about it, it means I didn't get anything and I'm going to be horribly depressed. Now back to the topic at hand. So when talking about fashion as art, I thought it would be helpful just to give kind of a broader definition of fashion and put it into context. And I'm going to be using the Oxford Languages Dictionary definition. Now, fashion is described as a popular trend, especially in styles of dress and ornament or matters or behavior. And I'm going to be focusing on styles of dress and apparel. Now, when we see clothing today, and really in part of social media such as TikTok, we use fashion as a form of expression. You can convey a lot about yourself by what you are wearing. And style and fashion isn't static. You can change your appearance every day if you like through fashion and through clothing. And I think that's really the most fascinating part to me. But the lens that we look at it now, it really is fashion for adornment. You see concepts, I know on TikTok it was really big, a concept called quiet luxury, where you have people wearing clothing, very basic clothing, a white t-shirt, maybe cut off jean shorts that appear to be more financially conscious, not uber expensive, but really that white t-shirt is like $200 to $300. So it's a subdued form of luxury masking as being something affordable to portray a different view of yourself. But what I'm really fascinated in is how fashion had turned when you go back hundreds and sometimes thousands of years. Clothing served as a functional item, as a necessity, as shelter for your body outside of a physical structure. And you go back to the early time of humans or ancestors using animal hide, furs, woven greenery as their own textiles to cover themselves against certain elements, or using it as armor if you weave a certain plant. And how over the centuries, it turned into more of a status symbol, and the function of it slowly got muddied and lost. And what we don't realize, and what I think a lot of people who are not deep into the knowledge of how to construct a garment, what goes into designing it, the correlation between function and art are two completely separate ideas. Art isn't supposed to function. And if something functions, it can't be art. But I really do feel like both of these things can be true. And I'll tell you why. The perfect example and time period of fashion serving as art and function I'm going to focus on the medieval times. And this was a mix of garments serving as a function. You wore garments because a lot of times people didn't walk around naked, especially if it was winter. But you had beautiful textiles, intricate beading. You had artisans spending months crafting an item for whether it be royalty or noblewomen. Or you had those in the lower classes making their own garments for function. You still had to adhere to a certain style of dress, but you needed to make it functional. You needed to have linens. You needed to have garments that if you were working out in the elements, you were still going to be covered, but you were going to have a more malleable textile to wear. But when you look at the function of a garment, and I find really fascinating how garments could be art and beautiful, but also function as a form of communication. So for example, the wealthy nobility, clergy, religious figures wore more ornate items like long robes with embroidery, a lot of times gold, like precious metals, really high quality textiles, embellishments like jewels, pearls, and that communicated their status and how you were to address them, how you were to treat them. But those in the lower classes, often referred to as peasants, which has become a very derogatory term now, but back then represented the heavily working class, the nuts and bolts of the society. Again, they had clothing that was simpler. You had tunics, rougher fabric, sometimes rough fabric like we kind of think of as burlap. And they didn't have a lot of adornment because when you are working in your garden and farming, when you are doing washing, when you're doing laborious work, you don't want to have all of these adornments on you. And let's face it, they couldn't afford it. So garments in the medieval times were very much a tool of communication. And you see this often represented in portraits of the monarchy at that time. And the most popular example is of Queen Elizabeth I. And in her portraits, her garments and the adornments she had represented the story and the visual of what she was trying to communicate with her followers and her vast, vast kingdom. From the embroidery in her outfits to where the textiles came from, sometimes from other regions where she wanted to pull together different kingdoms. Signs of respect, signs of power, her orb, her scepter. All of that was communicating her status and also political ideologies. And what we see as what we would see as passive, but was very strategic, where you wouldn't automatically look at these paintings and see it as a political statement. You would see a beautiful portrait of your monarch that you could ooh and ah at. But those that were really paying attention could see the complexity in the message that she's trying to pervade. So we move through the centuries, and as we get into what I would say is our more modern area, past 100 years or so, we've seen clothing shift from function to status to representation to now a really common idea, and I've heard this from many people, is that they see fashion as frivolous and trivial. And there are a lot of reasons for that I'm not going to dive completely into, but that are completely valid. Now, one of the reasons that I believe that this idea of fashion and clothing being frivolous and trivial comes from, and I know I've mentioned this in previous episodes, but it's the rise of mass production in clothing. And we started seeing that more towards the 1960s. If you're a vintage fashion lover, you'll start to see this. You have clothing from, I would say, the 30s, 40s, and 50s and into the early 60s, where you get a lot of handmade pieces, or you get a lot of pieces that have labels that say made by XYZ for, or tailored by, where those were pieces that were constructed by hand. They're more than likely, from my experience, not completely flooded in the market, being that hundreds and thousands of them weren't made. But you see into the 60s, 70s, and definitely the 80s, and an explosion in the 90s of mass production in clothing, and markets get flooded with the same styles, this exact same outfit. Everybody tends to be wearing the same thing, and there's an importance placed on mass consumption. And so you see clothing as being almost a tool of gluttony, for a lack of a better term. And mass production of clothing really, and that consumerism and a focus on the commercialism of fashion, I do think watered down the field a lot in terms of people not seeing it as an art form. They saw it as a tool to make as much money as you can, as fast as you can. And you see that with places like Shein. I don't know a lot of the big mass production online retailers now, but in that sphere where you pump out as many clothes as you can, keep up on as many of the trends as you can, sell them for as cheaply as you can, and just pumping all of this stuff out there to where even for $50 on some of these websites, you can get a big stack of clothing. As opposed to decades ago, you would invest in one or two pieces of clothing. It was very common, especially with the states that I've helped with. And in our area of the Midwest, you have some families who, whether they were farmers, blue collar workers, white collar workers, they would have one really formal dress or suit. They would have one that's more casual, and they would wear those to the bone. And it was because a lot of times they were made specifically for them, or those people actually made the garment themselves. And that's where the art form lies. If you don't have the resources to buy mass quantities of something, you use what you have to make what you have function for you. But it can also be a form of expression. And I've seen many garments, whether it be designer or handmade from a seamstress in the 1950s. Sometimes if you don't have a label on it, it's really hard to tell the difference. The intricate beadwork, embroidery, a lot of those skills were passed down from generations. You see it in indigenous cultures where you have this beautiful beading that is part of their legacy, their family heritage, and it's passed down from generation to generation. And that's very much what garment making was. It was a skill that was passed down to you, especially if you were in a socioeconomic class where you couldn't readily go out and spend hundreds and thousands of dollars on a massive wardrobe. You had enough money to get a few yards of fabric and see how much you can make out of that. And with different ways of using darts, embroidery, you can customize that to where it's uniquely your own, one of a kind. How is that not art? And it's a big conversation in the art realm of how commercialism, and I've read this in numerous articles, and I speak out of someone, I'm not an artist. I sew clothes, I don't design them, so I'm not speaking from that creative side of it. I've seen articles say that commercialism has killed the art industry because now it's more of a money-making profit, and you're not making pieces that you believe in, that means something, that you want to say something. And I don't necessarily think that's true. I think we now live in a society where people are really struggling to make ends meet. And if you have a skill that allows you to make money off of what you do, you'd be hard pressed to find someone who wouldn't take that. And that's where it's a very hard balance in art. If that is what you do to make money, how can you balance the business side of it while also keeping intact your creativity and spontaneity and creating pieces that really mean something to you and not necessarily to who you think is going to view it? And that's very much what clothing is. And unfortunately, we don't get the luxury to learn how to make clothing, make it just so we can sit and stare at it and marvel. Materials are expensive. Time is expensive. I mean, if you just sit and think of all the things that you wish you had time to do, I often feel like, I just want to sit down, and I have all these sewing projects and patterns that I've been waiting years to do. And I have to ask myself, when am I going to have the time to do that? Do I have 4 or 5, maybe 6 hours to try to complete this garment? Do I have the fabric for it? Do I have the tools I need for it? I have to completely rethread my sewing machine. Now, if you take that and you place that over someone who makes garments for a living, and the fact that they have to dream these ideas up, they have to make them, they have to source the materials. That's an art form that not a lot of people are doing anymore because it's hard work. And that goes into another point. I've heard from artists of all sorts of mediums that if art is work, is it really art? And I don't have the answer for that. I don't believe so. But there are people that you often hear that. I hear these conversations all the time. And it's usually from people who are not in any kind of artistic industry. It's usually the consumer. So now I'm going to go into 3 different realms that I love to join together. And that is the idea that clothing can be art, it can be function, and it can also be history. Now, how does that all work together? So, those of you who have been in my shop, who have talked to me, follow me on social media, know that I love lingerie, specifically vintage lingerie. Bras, corsets, girdles, you name it, I have it. So, of course, when I see articles discussing historical lingerie garments, that definitely piques my interest. Now, briefly, I'm going to talk about an article that I found really fascinating, and I really feel like proves my point. In 2008, archaeologists were excavating an Austrian castle. And this castle and a lot of the archaeological artifacts that they found were from the 15th century. And one of those artifacts was a linen bra. They ended up finding 4 of them. Now, radiocarbon dating placed these bras between 1440 and 1489, and they were able to tell that they were C cups. Now, these bras weren't just bags that were placed over the chest. They were cut triangular. They fit right over the breast and looked very similar to what we see as being bralettes today. Now, back then, this was used as function. Now, while this garment was used for function, the author of this article, and if I can find it again, I'll link it in the profile of this episode, but they said they could tell that there was a level of design to it. It was functional, but it was also delicate and pretty. So you have the aesthetic side of it, you have the function, and now you flash forward how many hundreds of years, and it's a historical remnant. We have bras, bralettes, bandeaus. We're constantly building and playing off of that idea. And it was very commonly thought that specifically bras the way we know them today was a fairly recent design element. But this proved that societies have used clothing and adapted them in ways that we thought was only special to us in modern time. But you see that in the 1400s, people were still finding new ways to develop garments and make it work for them while also saying something. And can we also highlight the fact that this bra, again, is made of linen, natural material, and it's lasted hundreds of years. If you think of a lot of art pieces, whether you go to the Metropolitan Museum or any museum around you, what we see as art, especially art that you find in textbooks, are hundreds of years old, and they've lasted this long, and they still have that relevance. And you often see, I know it was said about Leonardo da Vinci, whether his sketches or paintings or inventions in his time were not necessarily seen as art. But now they're priceless. And it's very much like fashion. We place value on what we understand at the moment. And people also place value on things that they see others placing value on as well. And that's how these art pieces grow. You think of Dior's New Look silhouette in the 1950s. Very sleek and fitted at the top, and you've got just that beautiful belle flare on the bottom of the dress. That's a silhouette that was very ahead of its time in the 1950s and became heavily replicated even to this day. It started off as art, and even though it was commercialized and replicated by a lot of different designers throughout the decades, we still see that as a very quintessential piece of garment history. It bridged the art and commerce. And that's really the natural progression of things. We live in a very commercial, money-driven society. And a lot, especially now, you're bleeding the stone a bit. What can you make money off of? But that doesn't take the art aspect away. Now it's a little bit of a all over scattered tangent. But if we can frame fashion the same way as we frame great pieces of art that are hanging in a museum, those who create these pieces will finally get the recognition they deserve. For anyone who's been to New York, to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, they have the Metropolitan Costume Institute. And while sometimes it feels a little, I'm just going to say it's a little bougie, specifically because of the big Met Gala they have and some of the problems I've had with the galas in recent memory, they do an amazing job showing the public that this is art. It belongs in a museum. You can see through all of these designers throughout history, even garments that go centuries back, you see specific time periods, what each person who made this garment was going through. When they were making this piece for whoever commissioned it, you saw what that person was going through. If they were pregnant, if they were sickly and needed weights. I've read articles where some men and women in their garments, as the older they got, if they were a little unsteady on their feet, sometimes they would weight garments. And I believe the theory behind that was where it would hold them more firmly to the ground, help gravity do its bit. Really fascinating, you guys. I mean, I could do a whole series just on the really kooky, weird ways that specifically you can make fashion into medical fashion. Really interesting. But you see that with specifically the Metropolitan's Costume Institute, they have to throw these large galas and functions to raise money for restoration. Yes, garments need restoration just like paintings do, just like homes do, woodwork, furniture. And that's to preserve them for hundreds of years to come and study. And if you sit and think about modern designers in our time, I think back to a really pivotal moment in my life that took fashion out of this one-dimensional object and theory that I saw in a book and brought it into reality for me was when I was on an art study trip in New York City in high school. And the Metropolitan Museum had this beautiful exhibit. In their art galleries, this was fashion and paintings and other art. They had this beautiful exhibit on Vivienne Westwood. Now, when I say honoring, it wasn't a complete show just about her, but it was the majority of her pieces and really the only ones I care about. But I'm going to be pulling things from a New York Times article that was written as a review of this museum show. Now, this was in 2006, and it was Anglomania, Tradition and Transgression in British Fashion. Now, the article says it crammed 65 mannequins into the Met's normally serene English period rooms with effects and sound effects that are alternately lavish and helter-skelter, stunning, seductive, and annoying. Now, I tried so hard to find the brochures and just the programs that were there at the time. But that was in 2006. I was 17. I'm 34 now. I don't know where the heck those things went, but I just remember being in awe. And both me and my friend who went on this group trip together, we were the only two that knew who Vivienne Westwood was and how significant this was, that we got to see her pieces in real life. These beautiful 17th century style ball gowns, silk, satin, ornate, big powdered wigs. If you can find pictures of this online, I mean, I get speechless even talking about it and trying to just put myself back into that 17-year-old kid's shoes who really had no business being there. But I was honored that I was. And I specifically remember these beautiful spinal rib cage, I think it was chrome plated steel, almost corsets that were on some of the mannequins, and how I didn't understand at the time how someone could come up with that. And while I knew who Vivienne Westwood was, I was familiar with her. When you're young, you feel like the world just started existing when you were born. And not that this is someone who had shaped fashion history long before I was ever born. But that was a really pivotal moment for me in how I saw fashion. Now, when I was 17, I collected vintage clothing. I collected vintage pieces, but I didn't necessarily correlate the art aspect to it until I saw it put in practice. And to this day, I think about it as being such an amazing moment in my life that I would give anything to go back to, because I would see it with a whole new lens and a sense of appreciation. I've been lucky enough, I have one Vivienne Westwood piece in my collection. And now, especially after she just recently passed away, her pieces skyrocketed in value because now people saw the value in it. Much like art. There lies the struggling artist trope of you don't fully get appreciated until after you pass, which should not ever be a thing. Let's appreciate it now while it's still here. And you can say that about a lot of artists and designers, that their work was never really noticed until something tragic happened or, life naturally ended for them. And it really is a shame, because just think, if people had taken Van Gogh seriously when he was alive and truly saw the value in what he was making, think of the questions you could have asked him, the lessons you could have learned. I think about that a lot with designers that I've admired throughout the years. And the one that I feel like was really, really appreciated, and again, tragically left this earth too soon, is Alexander McQueen. Now, if you want to see a fashion innovator, artist, and someone who didn't follow trends, set his own standard, please look him up. There is a famous show that he did where I believe it was, I have the article here, Shalom Harlow in 1999. And she went out in this, what looked to be a very simple, strapless, and full skirt dress. And she stood in the middle of this revolving platform. And I don't know the mechanics behind it, but it was these mechanical arms that just sprayed paint at her. And she had this anguished, theatrical movements and facial expressions. And I feel as if it was at that moment that people really, really saw in real time fashion as art. And it's a lasting moment. I mean, you read anything about the most important fashion moments in history, usually that is the one that comes up. And this happened in 1999. It was really not that long ago when you think about it, that this is when the gears started turning. But how quickly things change, and it's always been a struggle to get people to see this as an art form. Now, I'm not saying that the white t-shirt that you're wearing that was, mass produced, I'm not saying that's art. There has to be intent behind it. If it was a white shirt that someone had made out of their mother's nightgown, and they hand did it, and it was thoughtful, and they wanted to recreate this into something beautiful that they could wear and have that memory of, that's art. But I'm curious on what you all think of that. Are you someone that you just don't see it as being art, and why? I have this conversation a lot, especially since I collect a lot of clothing, vintage clothing. I have designer and I have not designer pieces. But when you really look at it, inside and out, clothing is such a tangible object. It's art that you can inspect, you can get inside of. If you look inside, I have a Christian Dior piece. The innards of it are the most beautiful, fascinating thing I've ever seen. You've got beautiful boning and details that the outside world will never see, but it's there. And it's what's holding this garment up. It's what's giving it life and shape. And that is an art form. What you put into something is what gives it life. And that is exactly what fashion is to me. And I hope it can become like that for a lot of people. I want to end this thought on one of my favorite quotes as it pertains to fashion and style. And it's by style icon Iris Apfel. If you don't know who Iris Apfel is, Google her and watch the documentary Iris. I have never been so inspired by someone who uses clothing and fashion and accessories to make a statement. And she just doesn't follow any rules that she has to wear this day and this another day. Everything she puts on her body is art, and she has a reverence for it. And I love how it's not even just designer pieces. She'll go to a bodega and find a cool beaded bracelet, and to her, it's wonderful. She sees the art and beauty in so many things that other people may not. And this quote really resonated with me. And she said, when you don't dress like everyone else, you don't have to think like everyone else. And that really is what fashion is. It's freedom. It's freedom from the world that you live in that dictates what you should say, how you should act, what you should wear. And I know growing up in North Dakota, it was very hard to express yourself through clothing because you were often, and I know this is the case a lot of places, subject to a lot of bullying and ridicule if you wore what was outside of the accepted fashion. And for my time in my area, it was very much, if you didn't wear Abercrombie and Fitch, you were a weirdo. And if I had heard this quote growing up, it would have given me just so much more confidence in what I was doing. And I wore what I wanted. But it would have just given me so much more freedom to unabashedly just wear what I wanted to. And not be so embarrassed by wearing this wool beaded 1950s cardigan I got at the thrift store and say, no, I found this treasure at a thrift store. And even though I have to shop here as a form of practicality and function, I found a beautiful piece that was hand beaded and stunning. But I'll leave it on that. If you really want to explore more fashion and wearing things that make you happy and you feel like really do express yourself, do it. Find someone that inspires you. It doesn't have to be a big designer, but when you're walking down the street and you see someone dressed in a way that captures your attention, that fascinates you, tell them. Sorry, my phone is just going crazy today. But tell them. It can be someone on the street. It can be a great aunt. It can be really anybody. And let them inspire you. And you really will see an art form in it. Because style is not something that everybody has. And it's not something that's easily learned. But just like with a lot of artists, there are people that just have that innate ability to turn anything, even the simplest of a garment or t-shirt, into a work of art. And I just think that's the coolest thing of all. So empower yourself and find someone who really will inspire you to wear and express yourself how you want, no matter how bizarre the outer world thinks it is. So that's your challenge. Well, I got through this episode without turning on any of my music, but of course I forget to put my phone on silence. And the traffic is just insane today and really loud, so I don't know if that really did anything. But, I get an A for effort. I tried. I really, really appreciate you all sticking around and listening to my thoughts on style and fashion. And I do think I will do an episode in the future just about fashion history and maybe garments that have been recently discovered that are relevant to what we wear today. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. I had someone approach me about possibly teaching a class on it, but as with a lot of things in art and humanities and fashion realm, people say a lot of things, but it never really happens. So maybe one day. And I can just talk all day about history and fashion and how they relate. Thank you so much for joining me. And whether it be a week from now, 2 weeks from now, a month, 6 months, hopefully I'll see you back here for the next episode on whatever topic I choose at that time. Thank you so much, you all, and have an amazing, amazing week.